Okay, so today is the first episode of the Fungal Mind, and I'm Infinite Beings, and today's episode is about networks, and networks' classical definition. First would be an arrangement of intersecting horizontal and vertical lines, or second, a group or system of interconnected people or things. And personally, I'd say the second one is probably a better definition, and the first one certainly has its areas of application, but for today's episode, we'll be more focusing at least somewhat close to the second definition, a group or system of interconnected people or things. Ultimately, to me, though, a network is an intelligently arranged system of signals that arises in an infinite array. Networking being the transmission and reception of signals between networks. Now, let's give some examples of human-created networks. The World Wide Web, which spawned the internet, social networking, and services for exchange. Power lines, airlines, suburbs, cities, and all of its transportation methods. Language is even a network of meaning and corresponding understandings. And even with all of that, and the trade networks that humans have created, they pale in comparison to the actual networks of cells, proteins, bacteria, and funguses that effectively create the human body. A couple more examples in nature would be spider webs, ant colonies, schools of fish, flocks of birds. But the point I'm really getting at is that everything breaks down into networks, and how networks are intelligently structured even from the basis of the fabric of the universe, and how atoms are just networks of atomic rules that follow basic principles, and these networks ultimately build up even bigger and bigger and more complex networks. So even if you look at water is dihydrogen monoxide, so you have two hydrogens and one oxygen, meaning that the two hydrogens bond to the oxygen, but also if you look at the way the charges are arrayed, the hydrogens create an interesting networking effect that allow them to do something called hydrogen bonding, which ultimately creates a very interesting crystalline network when they bond with each other, which is why water really has all of the functions that it has. It's able to go in and out, meaning from a gas all the way down into a solid, just by changing the amount of space between all the crystalline structures that the atoms create. Now, networks, they really affect humans in such a deep way because our thought patterns are just networks of information that correspond to frequencies. And the frequencies are essentially the wavelengths that we're riding in our mind. And some thoughts are obviously higher in frequency and contain more information and have more meaning within them to the conscious receiver. And then a more low vibrational thought would contain very little information and would hold no real merit to a person. And it's interesting because networks are always networking with other networks, even when they're not particularly aware of them, because everything is so interconnected as an overall grand network that I suppose we could call the universe. these networks and of course, as more intelligent networks arise, you'll notice that the intelligent networks use the natural networking capacities around them to their advantage. Whether it be insects, animals, bacteria, fungus, it doesn't really matter. They all use the networking capabilities around them to essentially network themselves even. Funguses will ejaculate spores into the atmosphere and let the wind carry them to various locations, and they land into billions of various spots, and wherever the conditions are correct for those spores, they begin to arise, and mycelium grows and fungus is born. Because it's spread out its spores in a network-like pattern throughout the environment, which in and of itself is a network. And it let its spores hit all the individual nodes, and whichever nodes were accepting of its genetic material allowed for the birth of the mycelium. And there's so many instances of insects, how insects like bees go around and they pollinate various flowers and they release pheromones and scent trails which lead all the other bees to the various different honey holes that they need to constantly produce more food for the colony. And of course, as we've mentioned before, the environment is a network, and that what they're doing is networking. Now, if you look at how humans network in a variety of different ways. Now, we have our natural way where we would go into nature and learn the ways of all the animals and the plants and the land itself and how it fluctuates and cycles, and we would essentially be networking and really have our own place in the network. But as things have gotten more complex and cities have arisen and human networks have expanded beyond more than their generally natural capacity, we see humans networking in a variety of different ways, where instead of networking with nature, humans are networking with themselves and essentially creating various forms of cannibalism in the wake of that networking within itself. The consumerism has created such a capitalist, such a competitive mindset that people are now trying to make a better life for themselves at the expense of others. And this famine mentality is ultimately because we're not networking with nature anymore. People often take for granted the fact that we're even able to network through humans, and that we're able to go to the grocery store and get food, and that there's someone that comes to your house and hooks up your internet, and that there's all sorts of various ways we communicate and entertain ourselves, all within the confines of often our house, often within a very small section of land that we call our community. Or even then, even if your community is large, How many roads do you really take? How many routes do you go down? Where's your conscious mind activating? What areas of space is it activating? And are you networking with something bigger than yourself, or are you doing the same things over and over, in and out, and staying in the same areas? Because as people, we need to be moving to grow. We're so used to migrating and changing environments. That's why people love traveling so much, of course. But when we build these commitments and stay in these cities and work these jobs and live the same day in and out, only to find ourselves enjoying a day or two off on the weekend, and, what do we do there? Almost always people are just living within the same networks still, just resting. Almost like people have designed a network of death where everyone can just comfortably live until they're dead. And the same amenities and the same experiences are occurring over and over and over and over. But the thing is, I know there's a deep desire in the human consciousness and the network that is in our minds. And people have desires of all sorts of different dreams and capabilities and skills that they want to hone and experience. And the thing is, it's just a matter of communication, and it's a matter of what sort of vibrations we're tuning into and what sort of networks we're aligning ourselves with. Because networking is ultimately everything when it comes to the communicational channels that we decide to project our energy and retain energy from. That's ultimately going to determine whether we end up just another cog in the machine, just another note in the symphony of this national song. Or if we're going to play our own melody and do what we're all naturally meant to do, which is we're all universally adept to be free and to play and live our own lives. With how sick humans have become, this planet has become a psych ward, but ultimately it's just a playground. And we can do whatever we really want if we so desire to. We can build some of the most beautiful planes around. And people are already doing that. People are already creating their own lanes, even on this planet. You just gotta find them, and you gotta network and build your own networks. And if you want to become a better player, you have to play with smarter players. You have to be willing to be the dumb one in order to become a smarter person. What networks are you hanging out with? What kind of intelligences are you consuming? Because we often eventually become what we consume. In the short term, sure, what we consume becomes us, but in the long term, we gain the attributes and the genetics of that which we consume. Every single interaction, every single experience had is going both ways. It's being transmitted and received. It is known to all intelligences capable of reading such a language. And really, that's all that I have to say on networks, because this is ultimately leading in towards intelligences, and that's the next episode. Because intelligence is what's ultimately interacting with all these networks, and ultimately we created these networks. So I look forward to talking to you guys about that in the next episode. Peace and love.